Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Schulman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Schulman family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 205, A Yiddish Family. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And before we get started on today's interview, we have an update on what we talked about last week, which was the teaser for our upcoming Kickstarter campaign to fund the first book of collected excerpts from the Judaism Unbound podcast, which we are calling Judaism Unbound Bound. So we're thrilled to be able to share with you that the Kickstarter has officially launched. Today is the official on-air launch for the Kickstarter, and if you head over there, you'll see that it's already generating a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. I can't tell you how excited we are to see how much enthusiasm there is to turn our podcast into something that you can physically hold in your hands. We're thinking that the book is something that people who listen to the podcast will really enjoy. By the way, if this project is successful, we hope it'll just be the first of a number of Judaism Unbound books over the next few years to come. Because, as we've said many times, we're a shoestring operation and we're trying to figure out new ways to fund Jewish activity in the new Jewish future that we're exploring. We don't actually have the money to produce this book on our own, so we need to raise the money through a Kickstarter. And it made the most sense to us to raise the money from our own listeners, from the people who are already enjoying the podcast. But I want to suggest that it's not only for you that this book is being created. We meet a lot of people all the time who are kind of on the same wavelength as we are, and we ask them, have you listened to the Judaism Unbound podcast? And it's not only that they haven't heard of Judaism Unbound, listening to podcasts is just not something that they do. So this is a way that you might be able to give a gift of the Judaism Unbound podcast to someone that you think will really love it or someone that you really are hoping to change their mind. Anyway, we're off to a great start, but we still need your help to make our goal. And then if we exceed our goal, it's just going to make the project better and better. It's just going to make the book more beautiful and more useful. And it's going to allow us to start getting going on producing more books. One of our earliest guests was Hello Mazel, and they were the biggest, most successful Jewish Kickstarter in history. I think they raised something like $150,000. I don't think that's really realistic for us, although if you can make that happen, we would be eternally grateful to you. But let's try to go for number 2. Anyone who contributes to the Kickstarter in this, our first week, will receive a special sneak peek at who our guests are going to be in the upcoming weeks on Judaism Unbound. We'll send that out to you at the end of this coming week. It's so easy to support this project. You can either go to Kickstarter and search for Judaism Unbound, or you can just go to www.judaismunbound.com/book, and you will be immediately forwarded to that Kickstarter page. So thank you to all of you who have already supported this project, and thank you so much to everybody who heads over there right now to support this project. It's a great way to support Judaism Unbound, and it's a great way to actually have something that you'll be able to keep, and a way to share Judaism Unbound in a new format with the many, many, many people who are still accessing Jewish information through that old stuff books. So now let's jump into today's interview as we continue our series on Yiddish in America, which we're putting together in collaboration with the Yiddish Book Center. Our guests today are Asya Vaisman Schulman and Sebastian Schulman. A couple of weeks ago, we talked to Aaron Lansky, who founded the Yiddish Book Center. And last week, we talked to Nomi Seidman, who was an early intern at the Yiddish Book Center and now is a professor and has been a professor and a scholar, an important scholar for a long time. And today, we're talking to people who are on the earlier side of their career, who have fallen in love with Yiddish and made it an important part of their careers. And in the case of our guest today, an important part of their lives outside of their workday. In addition to their jobs in the Yiddish world, they are actually raising their daughter as a native Yiddish speaker. And we're going to get into that story early in our interview. Asya Vaisman Schulman is the director of the Yiddish Language Institute at the Yiddish Book Center. She is also an adjunct assistant professor at Hampshire College. She teaches Yiddish at the Yiddish Book Center and at Hampshire College. And before she joined the Yiddish Book Center, she taught Yiddish at Indiana University, where she was also the project manager of the Archives of Historical and Ethnographic Yiddish Memories. She has a PhD in Yiddish from Harvard, where her research focused on the Yiddish songs and singing practices of contemporary Hasidic women. Sebastian Schulman is the executive director of CLES Canada, an organization founded in 1996 to teach, nurture, and present to a broad public the best of Jewish traditional arts and Jewish culture. Prior to coming to CLES Canada, Sebastian Schulman was a development officer and the director of the translation initiatives at the Yiddish Book Center. He is completing a PhD at Indiana University writing on Jewish life in Soviet Moldova. We're excited to have a conversation that it seems like for many people who are involved in Yiddish stuff is not uncommon, where the professional life and the personal life intersect. And so let's jump into this conversation. Asya Vaisman Schulman, Sebastian Schulman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much.
So let's start. You both do really interesting things on your own, and there are overlaps, but let's talk about the area of the greatest overlap, I think, at the beginning, which is that we've heard that you're raising your daughter in Yiddish. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's a somewhat unusual situation, and we'd love to know how that came about.
Yes, our greatest collaboration to date has been our daughter, Tzina Chaya, and she's now 7 years old. And, so much of our life revolves around Yiddish. We're both deeply, deeply into this world and this culture that it was sort of a no-brainer to raise our daughter in the language. And the setup we have now is that I speak Yiddish exclusively in all contexts with Tzina, and Asya speaks a mix of mostly English and also some Russian. And Tzina also speaks Russian with her grandparents, with Asya's parents, and she, at school, living in Montreal, she gets French and Hebrew as well. So Tzina has a very full head of languages. And but why did we choose to raise her in Yiddish? Because it's so much a part of our lives, and we wanted to have her get access to the culture that not just means so much to us, but gives her access to 1,000 years of Jewish history and song and literature and culture, to a sensibility that I think a lot of us have a sense of, but not necessarily depth in. Certainly the household I grew up in felt very Jewish, but in a non-tangible way, and speaking Yiddish, making every moment of every day somehow Jewishly inflected is quite incredible. So it sort of just seems like if Asya and I are doing Yiddish all the time, it would be sort of unfair to exclude Tzina from all that fun, and it also is good for her.
Yeah, and for me, even though I'm not the one who is speaking Yiddish to her at home, in my family, actually, the chain of speaking Yiddish is practically unbroken. So, for 1,000 years, all of my ancestors spoke Yiddish, including my grandparents, and to a lesser extent, my parents. And so, although I didn't grow up with it, once I studied it, I kind of picked up the very, very brief gap in the chain. And so it makes a lot of sense for Tzina to continue with Yiddish. And it's pretty cool that she has this 1,000-year connection.
It makes me think about the famous story about Eliezer ben Yehuda, the person who sort of resuscitated the Hebrew language, modern Hebrew language, having spoken only to his son in Hebrew in a world in which nobody else was speaking Hebrew. So you could look at that and kind of say, well, you're setting that kid up for not being able to communicate with anybody, or you can say that it was prescient and prophetic to say, no, this is really going to happen. And actually, my kid is going to be in the best position to communicate with everybody in the future, as it turned out, at least in that area of the world. So I guess my question is, when you raise a child in Yiddish, what is the future that you imagine, that you hope that child has? Or is it more like you initially put it, Seb, which was kind of like, we love it and we want to share that with our daughter?
Well, just a quick note, Yiddish is in a completely different situation than modern Hebrew was at that time, because there are hundreds of thousands of Yiddish speakers currently, a very large proportion of whom are children. They, of course, belong to Hasidic communities, which, are not the primary group that our daughter communicates with, but they're all there. And she has this interesting by knowing the language, if she does become interested in becoming more involved in Hasidic culture and Hasidic communities.
Sina does have friends that she's met through klezmer festivals and Yiddish gatherings. And so I don't think Sina feels like Ben Yehuda's son did, isolated or as sort of like a pioneer. I think Sina feels connected to community through Yiddish and through Yiddish culture, if not always in the language. And I'm totally ready for her to rebel. She's a very strong-willed kid. Wake up one day and not want to speak Yiddish. But I think the foundation that we've sort of laid down for her gives her access to the Hasidic world, to modern Yiddish culture, to all kinds of things that will serve her well, whether or not she's the vanguard in her adult life. And Montreal is very different than other places in North America and really anywhere else I've been in terms of Yiddish. It's very sort of normal here. It's not the choice it is for a lot of Jews in the United States. And, we're newcomers to Montreal, but we noticed right away, I'm walking in the neighborhood with Sina and we're speaking Yiddish, and people will come up to us and chat. And it's interesting, but it's not sort of this remarkable event that it can be even in New York or places where there's a lot of Yiddish spoken. So Sina feels very much at home in the language and has a lot of opportunities to, even if she's not speaking it with other people, I feel like she feels she lives in it.
And she's already learned the lesson that if she speaks Yiddish, she sometimes gets free cookies.
the free cookie plan for education. I like that.
There's this great Hasidic bakery here. It's called Chesky's on Bernard, which you should all go get some babka. But Sina and I were speaking Yiddish and like picking out what we wanted from the counter. And, I'm speaking Yiddish with the young woman behind the counter. And all of a sudden the baker runs out with a long beard and flour all over his face. And he's seeing these non-Hasidic people coming and speaking Yiddish in the bakery, and he wants to know who we are and what we're doing here. And he was so charmed, he gave us a free box of cookies.
So I'd love to start with a little bit of an understanding of the story of how both of you came to Yiddish and came to love Yiddish and ultimately build your entire, most of the time we're talking to somebody who put their professional life in whatever they're talking about, but you've put your entire life into it. And it would be fascinating to know kind of how that started.
For me, although I didn't grow up with so much Yiddish language, I grew up with Yiddish language and culture being extremely important. My parents have been very active in the Yiddish world. They created the first very large Yiddish website on the internet that was at the time called the Virtual Shtetl. And growing up, I listened to Yiddish music. I would sometimes go to this Yiddish club with my dad. And I've always really loved languages. My favorite subject in school was French. So when I was in high school, I started taking private lessons in Yiddish with Sheva Zucker, who is the author of one of the most popular Yiddish textbooks currently being used. And it was great. I really enjoyed it. And then when I went to college, it just sort of made sense to continue with Yiddish and then to go on to major in it and do some summer programs and get a graduate degree.
My family is a very typical American Jewish family. Born in Los Angeles, grew up in New York. And, my family is very, very Jewish, palpably Jewish, but in no discernible, tangible way. We were not religious. We were not, didn't have deep ties to Israel or anything, but very much had this sensibility of being Jewish. And I wanted to understand what that was all about. So when I graduated high school, I went to Israel. I immediately understood that this is important. This is a piece of the story, but this is not what I am looking for. This is not me. This is not us. And when I was an undergrad in Montreal, every day I would be going to my Hebrew class and I'd be hearing a Yiddish class right next door. And it sort of piqued my curiosity. And in Montreal, language is constantly on your mind. When you walk into a store, you have to make the calculation between English and French. And it sort of dawned on me that the language community that I'm supposed to belong to is Yiddish. So I actually started with an internship at the Yiddish Book Center a long time ago now. And I came back to Montreal and just fell into this world of Yiddish and have fallen deeper and deeper and deeper until I met Asya. And Yiddish has sort of taken me all over the world and continues to do so.
I was on the Yiddish Book Center website in prep for this episode, and I think on like the homepage, it said something like, click here, open a culture. And I was just like, whoa, that's a great branding thing. And B, there's a truth to that. Like there is a way in which this is a world. And this, by the way, it's not only Yiddish where this is true. Languages are each kind of a little mini universe and cover everything from, deep ideology, communism, Hasidism, et cetera, to, daily life things. I don't know how to say, I'm going to go grab dinner with somebody in Yiddish, but that's something that people say in Yiddish. So I guess I'm curious to hear more about that. Like, for somebody to enter into the Yiddish language is one thing. What does it look like? And maybe this segues into some of your professional work too. I know the line is blurry, but like, what does it look like in your family or otherwise to not only immerse in, language learning, but the next step or the added step of diving into this incredible, vast culture?
One of the most powerful Jewish experiences, not just Yiddish, but Jewish experiences I've had was working for the Joint Distribution Committee. I was what they call a Jewish Service Corps Fellow in Moldova. So I lived in this Jewish community for a little bit over a year. And one of the reasons they sent me there is because it's very much a Yiddish-speaking community. At the time, this is about 10, 15 years ago, anybody over the age of, let's say, 40 fluently understood everything in Yiddish and oftentimes fluently spoke Yiddish. Didn't really help me on the street. I also had to learn Russian, but that's sort of another story. And I had to learn the local dialect of Yiddish, and I learned about this very specific place in great depth. But by going incredibly local, I felt immediately connected to a very global sense of my Jewishness. And JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, often talks about identifying and feeling your Jewishness in a global way. And I didn't really understand that beyond the sort of nice catchphrase it is until I was able to live in Yiddish on a daily basis in this community. And I feel like that's a very particular kind of experience and perhaps a very privileged kind of experience that I had. But I don't think you necessarily have to have it. I've seen people who have learned Yiddish in a North American classroom and go very deep into Yiddish culture in that way. Like I say to people when I'm explaining what Yiddish is, Saturday is Shabbos, whether you keep Shabbos or not. Shabbos is Shabbos is Shabbos.
I think you need to clarify maybe that what you're saying here is the word for Saturday in Yiddish is Shabbos. All of the other days of the week are Germanic, except for Saturday, which is from the Lashon Kodesh, the Hebrew component of Yiddish. So that's why it's significant, is that the day of Saturday is marked just by virtue of saying its name.
Exactly. So, and there's a million different examples like that, where through the words that you use, your world is shaped. So, I think it works both on the level of minutia and on this macro level, but you feel connected to a world of people. And this is the last point I'll make, that sort of global sense of Jewishness makes me feel very connected, not just to Yiddish-speaking Jews, but to Jews of all colors and races and languages and cultures in a much deeper way than I felt as, growing up as an American English-speaking Jew, being interested in Israel. Yiddish really opened up all of the other Jewish stories to me in a way that those other Jewish spaces did not.
I guess I would love to hear from your perspective, and this is like a grand, huge question that I'm going to ask in a way that is not fair to you, but it's a big question that I'm going to put shortly. What is Yiddish? Help us understand, like, for somebody who knows nothing about Yiddish, has never interacted with Yiddish, what languages are influencing it? How long has it been around? Who's spoke it at different times? What are some of its evolutions? Like, what is this thing that we're talking about here in this very awesome, in my unbiased view, unit of episodes? What is it?
So Yiddish is a Germanic language written in the Hebrew alphabet, and it is about 1,000 years old. So Jews who were living in German-speaking lands about 1,000 years ago were speaking, and they were speaking various dialects of German. Linguists call it Middle High German, and they were using words of Hebrew origin. It's called Lashon Kodesh, which is kind of biblical Hebrew and Aramaic, to talk about Jewish concepts. And at that time, there was also a very small component from Romance languages. And initially, before it became a separate language, it was Judeo-German. It was basically a Jewish dialect of German, just like there were Judeo languages in other places, such as Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish.
Is there a difference between a Judeo language and Yiddish? Is Yiddish something that transcends Judeo and it becomes a language in its own right? And how does that happen?
Yes, exactly. So over time, Yiddish developed into a separate language rather than just being the Jewish dialect of a different language. Starting in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, Yiddish speakers migrated east to Slavic-speaking lands. And so in addition to Lashon Kodesh, which is the Hebrew-Aramaic component, and the Germanic and the Romance component, Yiddish acquired a very large Slavic component as well. And there's this popular misperception that Jews lived in Russia. So people might think it's a Russian component. That's actually not quite true. Jews lived mostly in the areas that are now Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. And so the Slavic influence is from those languages. And a really good example sentence that people like to give to show these different influences on Yiddish is Die Bobbe macht cholent auf Shabbos, which means the grandmother makes cholent, this kind of a stew, for Shabbos. And Die is a Germanic article. Bobbe is a Slavic word for grandmother. Macht is a Germanic verb. Cholent is from this Romance component, from the Latin calentum, which means to heat. Af is a Germanic preposition, and Shabbos is a Hebrew word for Saturday. So in one very straightforward basic sentence, you can see all of the different components of Yiddish.
And is that, what turns it magically into its own language? It's sort of like Pluto, whether Pluto is a planet or not, but what's the definitional line that changes something from a Judeo language to a language in its own right?
An army and a navy, right?
No, I mean, that's really the answer. That one of the preeminent linguists of Yiddish, Weinreich, attributes this to somebody in one of his audiences who asks the same question: what is the difference between a language and a dialect? And he famously says, well, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. But I think that's the real answer. Any linguist would say it's more a political, social concept than it is a hard and fast linguistic term.
I'll be honest. When I think about Yiddish, I think it lives in a corner of my Jewish mind or heart where I think of it as like among the more tribal parts of who I am as a Jew. I'm not saying that's correct. I actually think very much it's not, and I'm going to get there. But I think that for whatever reason, I associate Yiddish with particularism, with, specifically Jews as opposed to others. It lives in that area of my mind, which is a silly area of my mind. It's not so simple, but that's where it is. And so I want to ask, because it's so clear to me in talking to you and to others in this series that it's very much not just, I look at this because I want to look inward and at my own little Jewish world. That's not a terrible thing, by the way. There are ways in which doing that is great. But it seems that for a lot of people, it's opening up this actually very universalist impulse. And so I wanted to ask really both of you about that. But Seb, I was curious to start with you because, and this is going to throw a whole wrench into the game of this question, but I know you're interested in Esperanto, which is in the realm of linguistics conversations, a really interesting kind of universalist move. Tell me where you're at on all this. What's the deal with particularism, tribalism, universalism, and Yiddish?
So I agree that Yiddish very much opens up people to things rather than causes them to look inward. And, as Asya was talking about the different components of Yiddish, when you start to learn Yiddish, you get curious about, well, this is from Slavic and this is Romance and how does this operate? And you get the image of Jews as a people that were very much in a multicultural dynamic milieu that, yes, we have all learned the important history of friction and violence that came out of there, which we have to acknowledge and recognize. But it's also a place of great exchange and cultural interpenetration, and it can be very exciting. And so in the language, you have both a distinctive language for the Jews, right, that reflects a sort of particularist bent, but because it has so much of the surrounding cultures and people in it, it very much points to the fact that Jews are a people among other peoples and looks towards the universalist aspect of our history and our identity.
As you're saying this, it reminds me that we should contextualize for people internal and external bilingualism, that Yiddish speakers themselves have always been multilingual. Historically, there were the two Jewish languages that Yiddish speakers generally spoke, Yiddish and Lashon Kodesh. Even if they didn't speak it, some portion of the population at least knew it somewhat. That's the internal bilingualism. And the external bilingualism, which was knowing the Jewish language as well as knowing the language of the surrounding people.
So where does Esperanto fit into this and my interest in Esperanto? That actually comes through my life in Yiddish. Esperanto was invented by Lazer Zamenhof, who is a Jew from what is today Poland. And he invented Esperanto in the 1880s. And growing up in that time, in that place, there was the Jewish question was an issue on the street. What is going to happen with the Jews of Eastern Europe? How do they get their rights? What is their place in the world? He first was an early Zionist, was deeply committed to Jewish peoplehood, but he looked at the early Zionist idea and he said, no, this is utopian. This is never going to happen. Then shifted towards a Yiddishism very briefly. He published one of the first grammars of Yiddish and had this idea to Romanize Yiddish, which is generally written in Hebrew characters. He wanted to write it in Roman characters so that it would be respected by the peoples of the world, and shifted away from that when he saw that that was not a tenable idea, and returned to an idea that he had as a teenager for a universal language, a language that would be a neutral linguistic space, a second language for everybody, that would ease sort of all of our intercultural pains and make communication easier. And he saw this idea as primarily good for the Jews, but as a side effect, it would also help everybody. And the way that Esperanto is constructed is very much to be a Yiddish for the rest of us, I call it. It combines pieces from different languages all over Europe, and it is designed to be spoken. So other universal language projects look towards Latin and things that are very static and elite. Esperanto is meant to be spoken. It's meant to go over borders. It's meant to be in the mouths of its speakers. And so it very much mirrors on sort of an ideational level the Yiddish that Zamenhof grew up speaking. And even though the Esperanto world is not a Jewish space anymore, I find Esperanto culture and Esperanto literature especially to be very captivating and to be sort of somewhere in there very Jewish, even if it's not a conscious part of that culture anymore.
Seb, I want to pick up on something that you said much earlier and probe at it a little bit. There are actually two things that I think are related, but I want to start with the first one where you said something along the lines of, in your experience, Yiddish is something that helps you connect with all kinds of different people, and and including Jews of color, I think you said, and I can imagine that when we spend a bunch of weeks on Yiddish on this podcast, we're going to get some emails saying, it's Ashken normative, and and rightly so. I mean, like that I think that there are concerns that the vast majority of American Jews are Ashkenazi, but that's changing, and we're not appreciating that, and nobody's appreciating that enough. And I'm trying to figure out how to juggle those two, how to, on the one hand, say we're trying to explore this phenomenon because it seems to be a much bigger deal in Yiddish. I don't hear about all these other things happening in Ladino. Maybe there is, and we're just unaware, and hopefully those will pop up and we'll be able to explore those. But I guess my question is whether you think that Yiddish is or will become or can become relevant to Jews who don't come from Ashkenazi backgrounds? And if so, how and why? Why would Sephardi Jews sort of take an interest in Yiddish?
Can Yiddish be interesting or relevant to non-Ashkenazi Jews? Well, just as much as it can be interesting and relevant to non-Jews, just like people who are not ethnically from France can be interested in French and French culture, anybody could find something in Yiddish, just like anybody could find something in any language, regardless of their personal connection to that language or culture in terms of their heritage. For example, I know some people who are very interested in Ladino who are Ashkenazi. There's nothing to say that it can't go in all of the ways.
First of all, I would say that Yiddishists and Rochel Kafferson, who's this cultural critic and journalist of contemporary Yiddish culture, who's amazing, makes this point in an article of hers that Yiddishists tend to be some of the most culturally curious people, particularly when it comes to Jewish cultures. And so you have a tremendous amount of curiosity, sympathy for Ladino and other languages and cultures. I would say that first. But can Yiddish or should Yiddish be attractive to non-Ashkenazi Jews? First of all, I would say that in some respects, it can be a model for cultural reclamation. I remember when I was working in Moldova for the Joint, there was a fellow that was working in Turkey that was having trouble, getting his sort of American sense of Jewishness to relate to the local Turkish Jewish community. And we were in Israel, and he got some Ladino materials and brought them back to his community. And they were sort of enlivened by that, sort of reaching out to something that was relatable to them. So on that level, I think Yiddish can be a model for cultural reclamation and culture building. But I also think, it feels very paternalist to be doing this and say that, look at us, Ashkenazi Jews. We're it's like a Ashkenazi white savior complex. I'm trying to argue against, and keep putting myself in the same rhetorical hoop.
No, I mean, I think we understand what you're getting at. I know that you're not saying Ashkenazi Jews or Ashkenazi Judaism has some like special expertise to teach all the rest of the Jews and that we're better. I mean, what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that we all can learn things across those different lines. But yeah, I mean, I understand the concern that you're bringing up. But I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about what we've hinted at already in a number of ways, which is the ways that Yiddish is more than just, words or speech or language. Yiddish is an entire kind of cultural realm. By the way, this isn't unique to Yiddish. I mean, this is true of many language. If we talk about English, if we talk about French, if we talk about any language from anywhere in the world, it's often about more than words. But it matters that with Yiddish, there are many other realms that are part of it. And I want to go to one in particular, which is music, because I know both of you professionally, personally, familially are deeply connected to Yiddish music. So let's go there. And to start, I kind of want to go to my own fifth grade classroom when I was 10 years old, and it was the very beginning of the school year, and I walked into the band classroom, the concert band classroom. That was the class I took because I didn't want to take orchestra and I didn't want to take chorus, and you had to do one of the three. And I walked in, and the first day of class, the band director went down the list and said, okay, what instrument are each of you playing? Very reasonable, obvious question to ask the first day of a class where you're all going to be playing instruments together. And somehow I had gotten to the first day of school and I didn't have an answer to this question. So we go on the list and everybody's saying, oh, I'm going to play drums, I'm going to play trumpet, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And it gets to me and I have to say something. So I say, I'm going to play clarinet. I don't know why I chose clarinet, but I remember a couple things about that moment. Really, there was something at play where even as a 10-year-old, I just thought of clarinet as like a Jewish thing. And I liked the idea of flexing my Jewishness through playing clarinet. And by the way, clarinet is a prominent instrument in klezmer, which was the only kind of Jewish music I was aware of at the time, which reflects all sorts of dynamics, but we don't have to go there at this moment. But I chose clarinet, and I think it wasn't so conscious, but I think that fact of how I thought of clarinet being like a Jewish thing, and I would say now being associated with Yiddish culture, was part of what led me to make that decision. So I guess I'm asking you to help me figure out what was happening there. I had this instinct that Jewishness manifested in what the kind of musical instrument I would be associating with. And that reflects some really interesting things. So I'm curious, talk to me about Yiddish music. Talk to me about the ways in which Yiddish culture is more than just the words that make up the language.
So for me, being involved in Yiddish was never just like studying Yiddish, teaching Yiddish. It's never in a vacuum. I think I sang in Yiddish before I did just about anything else, both listening to Yiddish music and singing it as soon as I could. You know, I've been very, very deeply involved in the klezmer Yiddish music world since I was a teenager and attending various festivals. And then, you know, once I'd been singing for a while, I discovered that I really, really love Yiddish dance. And I actually started the klezmer band when I was a freshman at Barnard at Columbia. And then I co-founded the klezmer band when I was in grad school. So this has always been a part of my Yiddish identity, was not just the language, but music and dance and these artistic elements of culture. And in my work today, I run the Steiner Summer Yiddish program, and I also run all of the song workshops and dance workshops for the students in that program. And for me, when I started with that job, that was a really important part of developing the curriculum of this course, was that we're not just sitting in language class, and we're not even just sitting in language class and then in literature class. We are also living Yiddish with our feet and with our voices and with our instruments, you know, whenever that is relevant. So for my students, in addition to language and literature, singing and dancing is like a mandatory part of learning Yiddish. And it actually also helps with language learning, because when you use a language with your body, a lot more of the synapses in your brain are activated and they help you remember things a lot better.
I really have to defer to Asya here, because even though I run Klez Canada, I am not a musician. And even though I've been a part of the klezmer and Yiddish world for a long time, Asya has been a part of it for much longer. The only thing I would add is that, you know, as a learner of Yiddish, it's very hard. You can't go on a study abroad program to Yiddishland like you could to France or Germany. So learning music and song in the context of the Steiner program, coming up to Klez Canada, that's where you really get a sense of deep cultural immersion. You know, learning dance also gives you a sense of the whole gestural vocabulary of of Yiddish. Song gives you insight into, yes, as I'm gesticulating, and your listeners can't see me gesticulating, but I'm gesticulating wildly.
They can feel it. They can feel it.
Yes.
Soak it in, folks.
But song gives you a sense of idiom, all these sorts of things. That's where, the deep immersion happens.
I'm curious to do a little bit of weaving this all together. If somebody out there is listening, whatever level of Yiddish familiarity they have, if they know, 3 words, if they know the 50 common ones that I said I kind of know because of family history, or if they're fluent, like, what would you say to somebody who is either thinking about making Yiddish a bigger part of their family's life, whether that's, the level you have, or just, taking some class together, whatever it might be? What would you say to somebody who's looking to do this? What should they be excited about? What's a reason to immerse in the waters that are Yiddish culture, that are Yiddish language?
I'm completing work now on a new Yiddish textbook. That's actually been the bulk of my work for the past 5 or so years at the Yiddish Book Center. And this book includes all of these things that we've been talking about. It's primarily a language textbook for beginning students of Yiddish, but it is meant to also be this Yiddish land for the students who can't go study abroad, because it is filled with cultural resources. It has Yiddish literature and Yiddish music through the multimedia website that we have, various posters, ephemera from the Yiddish world, from different centuries and different countries, a weather forecast, and clips from Yiddish films and oral histories with Yiddish speakers today and before. So for people who are interested in bringing Yiddish into their families, I guess the thing I'm excited to share is that they will have very soon a resource that will help them with this endeavor.
So, I would say that if you or you and your family is interested in diving deeper into Yiddish, don't be afraid. Don't feel like there is anything stopping you. There's so many different points of entry, whether it's signing up for a class with Asya's incredible new textbook, whether it's coming up to CLES Canada, which has programs for all ages of people, whether it's going to any one of the different gatherings or educational opportunities. There's so much going on, and people will be really excited to see you and new faces, and it's a very welcoming place that you feel a part of very, very quickly.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Schönen Dank.
Seid gesund.
Nice. The perfect way to end our episode. Thanks again to both of you, and thanks to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll stick around with us for the remainder of our episodes all about Yiddish. We've had some great ones so far. They're going to keep being great for the remainder of this unit, so stick around, listen to them all. To close this episode, as always, we're going to encourage you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. Send us your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, your commentary. All of it is good. Here's the first way. You can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com, Lex@JudaismUnbound.com, or both. We want to make one more reminder that we have our Kickstarter campaign rolling right now to raise funds for our Judaism Unbound bound book project. Bound, once again, not in our thinking, but in the literal sense of a bound book. We appreciate any amount of donation that you can send our way for that project, and you can do so at JudaismUnbound.com/book. Head there, share with your friends. We are so excited at the support we've had so far in this Kickstarter campaign, but we would really greatly appreciate even more in the coming days and weeks. So thank you so much. With that, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and this has been Judaism Unbound.